Hey everybody, Luke McElroy from Mets Performance Consulting. Welcome back to another episode of the Physiology Secrets podcast. Welcome from San Francisco, as you can see if you're watching this on YouTube. Tyler and I are playing around with some backgrounds, and it wouldn't let Nick do it on his Mac because the Mac is inferior to a PC. Look, today what we're going to talk about is we had a couple of questions come through. We're actually asking people to give us topics on Instagram. So if you're not on our Instagram at Mets Performance, please do it because it gives you the chance to ask us any questions you like, and we'll cover it in a future podcast. The question for today is from Zach Brown, who's just recently finished a 3-month program with us. And his question was, is there any benefits to peak his fitness with no events coming up, or should he go back to base training? So I might throw straight to you, Nick, to start with. Do you want to go through your opinions on whether there's any physiological benefit to peaking fitness now? Let's say the event's 6 months away, just as an example, or whether you think you should go back to base.
It's really sort of case specific. So like we've talked about a little bit offline of, well, you could peak now. I mean, there's no reason why you shouldn't or you can't really. It's just a case of do you want to see where your fitness has gotten yourself to at the moment and then have a bit of recovery and then build on top of that. There's always the potential of if you drop things back down and not peak in particularly now, are you going to maximize everything you've just worked on? Yes or no? But it is a good time, I guess, to have a look at where you've gotten to, whether you do some sort of benchmarking test, time trial, where you make up your own little race. You do like a 5K time trial if you're a runner, or 10K, whatever you like to do to understand, all right, what did this training actually achieve and get out? What did I get out of it? But then also give you a new baseline to then work off and build on that next block. So you might be able to say peak it here, and then, or for those who are watching, peak it. If you're listening, sort of peak where you are now, and then sort of build on top of that again, and give you that sort of next level. If you don't quite peak now, then is there a risk of maybe we sort of miss out on? We've kind of just done a whole block of training, and then we're just going to go back and, I guess, detrain ourselves a little bit and then go again, maybe. So there's no real, I guess, right or wrong. It just depends on what your motivation is more than anything. And if you have a particular goal that you want to work towards, it can keep the training ticking along, because particularly for guys based in Melbourne, racing might be still a long way off at the moment. So you might want to go and do a little mini peak just to, again, give yourself a new benchmark and a baseline, and then work off that to then have the next block. So you could look at it either way.
And I think a really key point is the motivational aspect, is particularly when you sort of speak about maybe not knowing when the next race is, and it's always good to do a PB. Tyler, do you want to talk about, obviously, at the moment, as far as you know, you've got an event coming up on the 6th of December, but just take us through your thoughts around whether an athlete should peak now if their event they might not even have an event. Just what are your thoughts around the whole peak and taper and maybe the benefits and negatives of doing that?
Yeah, I think we spoke about this a little bit earlier about peak, what peak is, and peak not being for everyone a set point. Like just during a certain block of training, and you go through a base phase and a more specific phase, and you're going to reach a peak. That's not to say that is your physiological peak, and you can't push beyond that further on. So. I guess what you were saying, and with my situation, it depends on what you're training for. So if I'm training for an Ironman, and I've been into 7 Ironmans, and not one have I gone through an Ironman and got to the finish line and thought, good, I'm glad I didn't do any more training. Like I don't think too many people are doing too much training for an Ironman or finishing that and thinking that they wouldn't have benefited from doing more. So from that point of view, there's just such a volume aspect to Ironman training that as long as you're not getting hurt, I think that's the key. As long as you're not getting hurt or you're not trying to maintain a super high level for a long period of time, that what we would call zone 2 endurance training, just building, I guess an Ironman training is a bit different. It almost is a lot of base training. So it's just more and more and more and more volume. So there's not really a limit there. My experience is I did a half marathon time trial essentially about a month, 3 weeks ago, something like that. And I ran 75, which is basically a PB. So I guess, would you say that I've hit a peak? Possibly, I guess if it's almost a PB, but that wasn't specifically me going training to get to that level. That sort of come as a byproduct of the volume I'm doing. If my long-term goal is to run a 72-minute half marathon at an event, let's just, as an example, if that's what I thought my limit was, well, then I wouldn't be trying to do that now. I wouldn't be trying to get to that point if I think that's my absolute limit, and then maintain that for 6 months or whatever it might have to be. But I think that the idea of using, just like we would anyway, using periodization of training blocks to do a base phase, do a specific phase, reach I guess a peak, for lack of a better word, or reach a certain point, test yourself in a simulation, a time trial, some sort of simulation, and then recover properly from that big block of training, and then go again, and potentially in this new block push yourself further and rinse and repeat, I suppose, for that sort of thing. As long as the recovery's there, as long as I'm not trying to reach my peak in a month's time and then maintain that for 2 months until races might occur, because that's when I think you're really starting to ask for trouble, is trying to sustain a very, very high level for a long period of time. So in terms of motivation in the long term, then I actually quite like the idea of peaking, but then recovering, and then maybe going again, and maybe you can then push that a little bit further next time from that build up of training. And maybe if you've got a race in 3 months, you've gone through maybe almost three race cycles, and that leaves you in better stead by the actual race because of what you've done in the meantime. I guess it's gonna be different for everyone, but I certainly wouldn't be trying to peak now and maintain it for a long period of time. I think that's the one thing to really avoid. And if you are gonna go for some time trials or some peaking or anything like that, set yourself a goal, have a go, and then recover properly before trying to then reset and go on for your next goal.
Yeah, and I think that's probably key. Context is really important. What are you actually training for? An Ironman is very different. An Ironman is very different to a sprint triathlon or an Olympic distance triathlon. And I guess if you've got a long time from now, I agree with everything you said if the context is correct. So it just comes down to, if you had a poor base phase to begin with, and you have a lot of scope for improvement in it by doing a base, then you could probably go back to base training. But if you already had a really strong base, you did everything right, and you've got 6 months, and you could probably peak in two months to 2.5 months by doing the right sort of training. As you said, you're going to get a new high, and depending on what you want to do, but like Ironman, it's probably a little bit different in the sense that even when you get to the specific phase, you're still doing a whole lot of volume because it's the most specific thing you can do. You're not going to be on threshold the whole way. So you probably can peak in an Ironman still, do the volume. And on the flip side, if you do like a sprint distance triathlon or whatever it is, a half marathon or something where you're maybe on the limit the whole way, there are benefits by doing the peaking. You talk about glycolytic enzymes functioning more because you get the high intensity. You can do the VO2 style, increase the mitochondrial biogenesis and all that sort of stuff. Or maybe the better example I should give is something that's more, let's say a 1500 meter runner where it's really tricky, or an 800 meter runner where it's really tricky to peak because it's such a fine line. By doing the work that you would do to peak the higher intensity stuff, you get the increased hypertrophy of the muscle fibers, and therefore you get more CP stores inside the muscle fibers and all those other things. And as you said, Tyler, you sort of get a new base. Like once you've got it, particularly with anaerobic adaptation, once you've got it, it takes a lot longer to lose it. So I think I agree that the timing is the important bit. Like it's not, as long as you're not going to injure yourself and you're not planning to stay peaked for a month or 2 months or 3 months, because that would just be silly, and your motivation is high, like you're psychologically pumped up and happy to do that. And I think there's no problem with peaking. And for me, it sounds like a good idea in terms of, I know not that I'm anywhere near peaking, so it's probably not the right example, but being able to hit PBs and feel fit and run fast and ride fast and all that sort of stuff is really a motivating tool, almost as an intermediate way to stay motivated when there's bugger all else to do in terms of events. So I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of periodize it. Don't try to be peaked for 3 months. That would be silly. You want to go up, let's say 6 months, for example, go up in the next 2 months, get peaked, drop yourself down for the next 2 months, and now you've got a proper 2 or 3 months to get peaked again and periodize it appropriately. Anything to add on that, Nick?
I think probably the other thing to look at is if you're already planning go back 3 or 4 months, and if you were planning to race now, and then you're also planning to race in 3 or 4 months' time, then peaking kind of makes sense. Like Tyler said before, it's like you're almost giving yourself that race prep that you would have had anyway. Peak, do it, go out and do a big brick session if you're a triathlete, or go and do like a half marathon or whatever would have been that close enough to that race you were going to do, because that would have followed that natural plan anyway. It's probably going to start you at that slightly higher level, but as you would with that overall plan, if you were planning to race now but you can't, and then you're going to race in a couple of months' time, you wouldn't go and build up to this first race and then just maintain that fitness level for 2 or 3 months and just try and stay at that. All right, I'm ready to go for race day for months on end until you got to the next one. You drop back down, you do another sort of building phase, and then you get back into that second race. So I don't think anything dramatically really changes for a lot of people. It's just where do you get your motivation in your training from? Is it from going out and doing some time trials and challenging yourself and trying to get a better result or give yourself a new baseline? Or is it, are you at a part of your training where you feel like, oh, now's normally a time I'd race and then have a solid recovery, so maybe I'll just take the recovery instead, because that actually could then lead to a breaking up. I know we talked about it the last couple of weeks of not only detraining but overtraining as well. You might fall into the trap of overtraining if you feel like you push all the way through to a peak or go a little bit longer to peak, then have a shorter recovery, because then all of a sudden racing comes back earlier than expected and you're back into training. Maybe it's a case of, all right, you use the recovery instead, and it's a bit of a mental refresher, which can be a positive for some athletes as well. So I think you don't necessarily have to change your overall annual plan a massive amount. You can probably still follow that reasonably. It's just then, all right, we don't have a specific event that we're going to. We're just going to work it into our training and then follow that same building progression.
Yeah, I think trying, without getting too cliche, the whole not being able to win a race at the start but being able to lose it possibly applies now. That, you know, what you do in your next month, you're not going to reach your goal potentially if it's December or February at Geelong or whatever it is that might go ahead. But I think you could certainly, maybe not make it impossible, but yeah, at the moment, I think to get through this next phase with no racing, the worst thing you could do would be to injure yourself, to burn yourself out, or
to do nothing at all.
Yeah, or to put yourself so far behind the 8 ball that when you do, Geelong's confirmed, let's say, in January, and you find yourself at such a low level of fitness that there's no way you can get there. One of those 3 things. I think basically if you're avoiding those 3 things at the moment, that's really, however you go about that, whether that is you like to build up and have a time trial as a peak as a goal. If you can't be bothered and you're just happy doing a certain amount of zone 2, along easy training, social. Well, we can't really do social training, but maybe it's you and your one friend or something, whatever it might be. I think at the moment, I think the mental game is probably as important as anything. And even if you do think that, you know, you've set yourself a time trial goal in 3 months, but you lose motivation in between now and then and you want some days off, I think go for it. If you burn yourself out during this period with no racing and then just can't get yourself up for when it really does matter, that's probably the one thing to really avoid. So I'd say be flexible. Don't feel like we have to be as concrete about our planning as we would be going into an A race or something like that. And keep yourself motivated. I've motivated myself I've been doing a lot of test sessions, and they're not all like half marathon time trials. They're run like I was doing a regular 5K at a set sub-max heart rate. Like I was running 150 beats, 5K, pretty easy. Doesn't really cause me any fatigue, but I see a fair bit of progression in doing that in my running pace at the same effort. And, you know, that's just a little bit of a motivator for me that shows progress is happening in an easy, relaxed way. So I've been doing a lot of things like that keep me, you know, you see some progress there and it makes you happy. But at the same token, I've done a time trial and I've done basically a 1 hour bike max and some things like that. So just recover and just keep enjoying what you're doing, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, and I think in terms of, as you said, the worst thing you can do is do nothing and lose all your fitness, and it takes you 4 or 5 months to actually get anywhere close to being race fit again. That's going to be a disaster. At the very least, I don't think COVID-19 as an excuse to get into bad habits. And I know myself that I think you break it's varied between 18 days and 60 days from what I've read, but a habit takes somewhere between that amount of time to form or break. So if you've got a really good training routine and you totally break that and for 2 months, then it's going to be really hard to get started again, even if you are motivated. And I'll find myself in the same boat there. I think the other thing we need to figure out is what does peak mean for you? And for an Ironman triathlete, peak is probably to do with volume as opposed to intensity. Whereas for a 1500 meter, it's reducing the volume and increasing the intensity, which has a high risk of muscular injury. And then on the Ironman side, yes, it still has that muscular injury, but more that overuse and tendonitis and all that sort of stuff that comes with overloading. But I guess you can be really strategic, given that there's no pressure to get to a certain load anytime soon. You can do a really gradual progressive overload and take it really easy and play around with different types of periodization. You can take this opportunity to still maintain your fitness or improve it. But then, work on your weak areas, such as your local muscular endurance, such as your glutes or whatever it is. It's pretty typical for an endurance athlete to forget about during a traditional build. You can take this opportunity to work on that. So I guess in summary of sort of what I'm trying to say is it's going to be very individual to the person. There's no problem in peaking. You can peak it, and then you're very versatile and say, all right, I've peaked, I've come back down, there's a race in 6 weeks, and you can be peaked for it again, no problem, versus doing absolutely nothing. And, we lose fitness 4 times faster than we get it and all this other sort of stuff. By doing nothing, it's really bad. Going back to base is fine. If you had a week, maybe you didn't have an optimal base in the first place, and that's fine. You can work on that base. It really comes down to what is your event, what are your strengths and weaknesses, and then tailoring the next however long, 3, 6, 12 months, hopefully not 12 months, to working on those weaker areas and making a more well-rounded athlete. Does anybody have anything to say on that?
Yeah, that pretty much covers it. I think that's probably it.
Awesome. All right, we might wrap it up. I think that's probably good for time. So again, if you're not on the Instagram page, I don't know why you're not. You should be at Mets Performance. We're going to ask these questions every now and then. Sometimes it's hard for us to come up with ideas. It's better if, hey, you guys just tell us what you want and we'll do it. So we've got a good little library of things to cover, but please jump on that if you do want to ask us some questions. Leave any comments below, any questions below, and we'll speak to you on the next episode. Thanks for tuning in.